So Peniel will give an address, and then we will have some time for quick responses from the audience, and then we will have a table group discussion. I will moderate it and just keep eye on the time. And then after your small group discussion, we can come back to the big group again, and you can ask more questions if you would wish to. Thank you.
Thank you, Katalina, for the welcome and the introduction. My name is Peniel Rajkumar, and I work for the World Council of Churches in the program on interreligious dialogue and cooperation. I basically focus on relations with Hindus and Buddhists. And it's a joy and an honor for me to be here with you all to address us on the theme. So I think before I begin, I need to follow suit to what Katrina has said and apologize to all the non-English speakers in the house. But I think I should also apologize to all the English speakers in the house because I'll be speaking in Indian English. And I'll embrace it as a sign of my own hyphenated identity, of somebody who embraces his in-betweenness as a migrant in Geneva. So when we look at, can we reduce the lights, please, so that, I would invite you to follow the slides, the PowerPoint presentation with me. The theme that is before us today is rising to the challenge of migration. We all know us. When we look at the question of migration, probably in some sense, we can talk about it as being a question which doesn't have borders, because the entire globe in some way or the other seems to be embroiled in this whole phenomenon of migration in all its diversity. The question of migration is a complex and a complicated one. As somebody pointed out, the phenomenon of migrations, it is probably right to agree that migration has created a melting pot of cultures. But the melting pot of cultures has developed some cracks and has become fragmented. There is much to say about it, given how migration has been projected as an issue which divides communities. Probably what makes it even more complex and complicated is the refugee question. And as we all know, this is not a recent question. Even when Pope John Paul was the Pope, in one of his letters to the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, he described the question of refugees as a shameful wound of our time, as a shameful wound of our time. So the wounds have probably deepened now in some sense. So as I was thinking of what would be a starting point for our conversation today, I thought probably a good point to start off would be from the theme itself, or we all know us. I'm aware that my colleague, Dr. Claire Amos, will be looking at it from a biblical perspective this afternoon, so I will not do much of biblical work on it. So I'll just use this as something to hang my random reflections on. So we all know us. If you look at it, it's a beautiful picture from India, they say, and it's got more people than, this is supposedly a picture of Noah's Ark. And if you look at it, there are more people than were supposed to be according to the biblical story. So a use of creative imagination to describe something which really is relevant for us today, and I'll come to that in a moment. So are we all Noahs? So when we look at the story of Noah, I think what strikes us is that it is a story of strange ethics. The ethics that comes out in that story is not an easy one. It is of people and creation dying on the one hand, And how do we make sense of it? And several people have raised questions about the ethics of this story. But one important thing that would be useful for us to think about today is to see that also as a story of a refugee. Look at Noah as a refugee who is fleeing with his family to save his life. And in this picture, we see Noah there with a sort of a divine cover over him. So it's a good picture which talks about God's presence with Noah in leading him to safety as he flees from the dangers of his time. So before I move on, I want to talk about how, when we look at the biblical passage of Noah, it belongs to part of a literature which is called as a resistance narrative, according to Ched Mayers, a biblical activist, a scholar activist. According to Ched Mayers, the portion Genesis 1 to 11 is a resistance narrative. So what it basically says is the story of an oppressed community saved from the wickedness of the powerful by God. So Noah, in some ways, is a symbol of this oppressed community who is saved by God's grace as he tries to flee from the wickedness of the powerful. And this is a depiction of the wickedness, and you see the ark in the corner. I don't know what the understanding of wickedness in that thing is, but I leave that to your imagination. So with that perspective, let's move on. So as I said, I will not be engaging in a detailed biblical interpretation of it. What I want to do today is to pick up on a dominant symbol that comes in Noah's story, the symbol of the ark. Of course, I won't be talking about the symbol of the ark. I will deviate from it. But the symbol of the ark is an important symbol in Christian history. For the Christians, the image of the church as the ark of salvation is something which strikes us. And also, one of the early Christian symbols that was used widely was the symbol of the ship, which is in some ways related to the symbol of the ark. A ship which is saved by God from the perils of the world around. And I'll be using a symbol today which is closely related. This is another picture of the church as a ship. I'll be using today for our own thinking a symbol which is related to the symbol of the ship and also related to the question of migration and the refugee crisis. I'll be using the symbol of a boat. And there is this beautiful quote which says, "We are all boat people," referring to Christians saved by the radical hospitality of God. That would be the line of thought that I'll be trying to follow in my presentation. We are all boat people saved by the radical hospitality of God. So the symbol of the boat will be something that I'll use to move ahead in our reflections today. So the symbol of the boat, in many ways, as we are aware, connects us to the recent migration histories. We call it stories of people, men and women who have been fleeing migration. This is a beautiful picture of a Vietnamese refugee who walks to Canberra with a symbol of a boat to say thank you for the gift of refuge. And not all stories are stories of gratitude and promise. The symbol of the boat, as we all know from recent history, we know one picture there is of the boat people from Vietnam. The other picture there is much closer from here, the picture of boats arriving in Lampedusa. So the boat today has become a symbol of migration, of the migration crisis in many ways. And there are boats and there are books which talk about boat migration and other things. So, but in many ways, the symbol of the boat is also a symbol of hope. This is a painting by a Syrian refugee who looks at this as being, the boat as being a symbol of both peril and promise, of both peril and promise. As we all know, it is also a symbol of risk and tragedy. The British Somali poet, Warsan Shire, in her very poignant, very powerful poem, Home, as these who immigrated to the United Kingdom, has these few lines from a poem. And this is what she says. You have to understand, no one puts the children in a boat unless the water is safer than the land. So that in some way captures the story of several migrant people, that the symbol of a boat is something which is of peril yet of promise. Yeah, this is few more lines from the poem, but I'm not going to read that to us now. When we look at the whole Bible, we also see that the boat, or something like a boat, is also a symbol of the journey from danger to life. And this is a beautiful picture of Moses, whose life was preserved through that casket that his sister made. Yes, Moses, a migrant whose life was saved from danger through this symbol. And it is not only in the Old Testament, even in the New Testament, we see symbols of it, of how the boat can be a symbol of this journey from danger to life. And very interesting, some of you may know this picture. This is a gift that Pope Francis gave to a Christmas gift to the community at Lampedusa. And it shows the Holy Family fleeing to Egypt in a boat. And it's a picture of Jesus and his parents as being refugees. So this imagination is not something that is present only in the recent past. Even in some icons, we see Jesus as a refugee in Egypt, going to Egypt on a boat. So we usually have him on a donkey. But there is this picture of even Jesus being associated with this boat in the process of seeking refuge in Egypt from persecution. So this probably cartoon sums it up all about our boat thing. Jesus, from the Middle East are you? Did you come by boat? Okay, when we look into the story of Jesus, we also see that the boat is a symbol of learning. Jesus often uses the boat to teach his disciples, to trust, to not to fear. And also not only his disciples, but also others. So it is a symbol of learning too. And it is also a symbol of taking risks and crossing boundaries. It is a symbol of taking risks and crossing boundaries. One of the things that we see is whenever Jesus encounters somebody who is called a Gentile in a foreign territory, he usually goes by a boat. So that the boat is a symbol of boundary crossing. And also, it is also about risk taking, because you remember the story of asking Peter to put his net on the other side. So it is trying something new. So all these, we can think of much more, but we need to move on, and I don't think half an hour is going to be enough time for us to look at all the boat imagery in the Bible. So these are some of the ways in which we can think about the boat as being a useful symbol today. So what does that mean? So what I want to reflect on now is what boundaries need to be crossed and what risks need to be taken in the context of the immigration question, and what needs to be learned anew. I'm not going to give you the whole thing because but I'll just point out a few things for our reflection today. What boundaries need to be crossed and risks need to be taken, and what needs to be learned anew. So let's come back to the story of Jonah. As I said, it is not an easy story of do-it-yourself spirituality. It is a difficult text, but some lessons can be learned. As I said, I am leaving the difficult theological interpretation to my colleague Claire Amos this afternoon. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at two very popular cartoons related to the story of Noah, which probably helps us to think about this immigration. The first one, is something to deal with the threat inside. I was reading some of these things about how Noah gives some of these, you find these things on the internet, about how the story of Noah gives us everything that is needed to live in the world. So one of the things that it said was, probably the threat to Noah was not so much from the flood outside as from the woodpecker inside. Some of you are probably aware of that. So one of the things that is important for us when we deal with the immigration crisis is to deal with the threat inside. We have some cartoons of this, the woodpecker drilling holes. Remember, the woodpeckers were also part of Noah's Ark. So probably a bigger threat for Noah, sorry, it has to be Noah, is not the flood outside, but the woodpecker inside. Oops. Yes, so it's not just the woodpecker, somebody says, but also the termites. So let's leave it at that. So threats to host countries are not just the immigrants who come from outside, but more, they are those who drill holes of prejudice and paranoia from inside. The ones, and there are several people, and in some ways the immigration crisis has been precipitated, made worse by those who spread prejudice and paranoia about immigration and immigrants. And that is something that host countries have to be really perceptive about. The common rhetoric that we find is that immigrants are a threat to national security, culture, and their resources. And sometimes people engage in a wordplay, a rhetoric, which mixes criminality and terrorists with immigration, and distorts the debate and makes the vulnerable easy targets. So that is something that we need to be aware of. Yes, this is more of this. From this sort of globalization of polarity, we need to move towards what Daniel Grudy calls a globalization of solidarity to engage with the immigration crisis. So the other way, how do we engage in this globalization of solidarity? One way is waiting for the vulnerable. So these are the snails making their way into Noah's Ark, and the rains have already started. Okay? And somebody said that the cheetahs, who are the fastest animals on to enter the Ark, had to wait for the snails for the Ark to move. So that's a nice way of helping us to understand what solidarity can be like. It is sometimes waiting for the weak and the vulnerable. Ben Soto, who's a Puerto Rican actor and activist, says, the melting pot of cultures, referring to immigration, is a dangerous place really. So the most vulnerable don't bubble up to the surface. They just settle like sludge at the bottom. So that is probably true. The ones most affected by this migration crisis are the ones who are the most vulnerable, the ones who are not the least skilled, so to speak. Okay, so this is something for us, and also racism is something which happens here. This is how people treated the Chinese immigrants in the U.S. So a picture. So how do we wait upon the vulnerable? And that is important for globalizing solidarity. So David Hollenbach says that the needs of for this solidarity need it requires that needs of the poor take priority over the wants of the rich. The freedom of the dominated takes priority over the liberty of the powerful. Participation of the marginalized groups takes priority over the preservation of an order which excludes them. So something for us to think about. Okay, so the other thing is also, what is also needed, one boundary which needs to be crossed is to move from an as discourse to a with discourse. So we no longer approach the question of migration with a discourse of migrants as problem, migrants as threat, but rather, how do we engage with? So the question of solidarity is a question of with. So that is the discourse that needs to take place. So we also need to cross the divide of problem versus people. There is a tendency to treat migrants as a problem rather than as persons. Political and policy language often labels them as part of a problem. Forced migrant, internally displaced people, refugee. Of course, these are important, these are needed, but sometimes we push it a little bit too much. And labeling can always create asymmetrical relationships. And more importantly, they can dehumanize. So what happens in this labeling is there is no adequate consideration to the humanity of the migrant. And when that is not possible, it is not possible to create just policies. So globalization of solidarity in a Christian language may mean remembering, or not dismembering, but remembering, putting together, understanding migrants through the theology of the Imago Dei. We should also be aware of double dehumanization, which can take place in these contexts. Aga Khan, I'm looking at the second one. Aga Khan, the former UN High Commissioner for Refugees, once said, "The awkward truth about human deprivation is that it demeans those who permit or ignore it more than it does those who are deprived." So it also not only dehumanizes the ones who are affected, but also the ones who have the opportunity to change. And that is something which is important for us to bear in mind. So we also need to move beyond the profit versus people divide. And somebody said this, and it makes sense. The fact that in our current global economy, it is easy for a coffee bean to cross borders than those who cultivate it raises serious questions about how our economy is structured and ordered. So something for us to think about. And also we need to move beyond these assimilation, integration, and multiculturalism imageries. Most of you must be familiar with these social theories, which look at migration or getting migrants used to their host countries as either melting pot or salad bowl. And we now have even the pizza and the tomato soup models where immigrants just spice up things on a base. So we need to move beyond these arguments also, because what they do is they do not, for example, they do not talk about questions of justice. They do not talk about questions of individual freedom. What they talk about is just culture as a static entity. And that is, and many migrant cultures are not static entities, they are dynamic, they evolve. And they lose sight of it, and it is not possible to move towards justice when some of these arguments do not have a notion of justice inbuilt into them. So I will skip through these. Okay. So what these things does is it ignores the gift of hybridity. These arguments, the experience of to be in between and the experience of migrants to be in both, which helps them to be beyond. So now, sticking on with the imagery of the boat, there are other images that I want to focus on. And there is this beautiful picture of Pope Francis in this church at Lampedusa, I think, who uses the boat as an altar, a symbol of the Eucharist. Okay, the altar there is made from a boat, and even in Cologne Cathedral, they got a refugee boat to be used as the Eucharistic table. And the Eucharistic table symbolizes several things. It talks about the radical hospitality of God, God's self-giving, and I'll come to that later. And it also talks about Eucharist is also about gifts, and I come to that. So one of the things that needs to be done when we look at this symbol of the boat as an altar is one of the things we need to do is to rethink hospitality. Hospitality is an important thing, and it needs to be rethought. So it is interesting, the Greek word for hospitality is philoxenia. Friendship, philo is philia, friendship, with a stranger. So we need to recover the friendship dimension. And there is this beautiful picture from Damascus from 1889. Which gives the story of a blind Muslim called Muhammad and a Christian, a dwarf Christian called Samir, who had this beautiful interdependent friendship, which helped them to live together, and it helped them to live through Damascus. So he would take him wherever through the busy streets of Damascus, and he would be directing him. So we need to recover the philia dimension. This is a real photo, because it is important for us. For example, Christians tend to emphasize love more than philia. But let us not forget that for most Christians to love the other, even our neighbors, is a mandate, a command, it's obligatory. But friendship is more about choice. We make a choice about the people that we make friends, and it is also about crossing boundaries. So it is important that we recover this friendship dimension of making conscious choices of whom we become friends with and moving beyond boundaries when we talk about it. The other thing to realize about hospitality is that hospitality is not about to do something for, to give something to, but being with and learning from. And learning from is important for in the migration situation. So we need to move beyond the idea of migrants as victims of history. In 2006, migrants sent home small amounts, US dollars, 100 to 300, more than 300 billion US dollars. And this was 3 times more than the money for global poverty alleviation received through overseas development from big donor countries, which was 106 billion USD. So who are working towards the reduction of global poverty? It is these individual stories of migrants. So, and also we know from history that they can revitalize, the gift that the migrants bring, they can revitalize the cultural and religious landscapes. This is a migrant church from Calais, St. Michael's. And it is, some say that it is held up by prayer and duct tape and plastic sheets. So that is what it is. So migrants have, it's an Eritrean, mostly Eritrean congregation, but that talks about something, quality of migrants, that they can convert spaces of invisibility into spaces of presence. And they articulate the idea of home not as a space, but as a movement, okay? A quality of relationship. So, as we reflect on the Eucharist, I want to end with this idea. What the Eucharist does is that it nourishes our faith. It feeds our faith. But what it also asks us to do is to stay hungry. And today is the Geneva Day of Fasting, John Geneva. It teaches us the right way to be hungry for justice and for peace. And that is, and how are we going to be both fed and to stay hungry in the right way? And that is what I want to leave with. And today, as we reflect, how do we as churches and individuals become part of the story of migration? What are the challenges we face and what are the gifts we bring? And the next few minutes, I want us to engage in a sort of a group activity, which is based roughly on this, this idea. You'll find colored sheets on your paper. There was this project that was done by Bern O'Donoghue from Brighton in Britain, who launched the art project Refugee Crossing in 2015. What he did was, using small colorful paper boards, he encouraged people to write words challenging proper misconceptions about refugees and migrants, which were deliberately placed in public spaces, such as stations, bus stops, and pedestrian crossings, to make passerbys think. And today we are going to write something to help us reflect about how we are in the migration story. We're going to make those boards. We're also going to write something about where we are in this journey, and what are the gifts that we bring, and what are the challenges that we face. So these are some examples of where these paper boards were placed. Yes, I'm done. So, and there are instructions. So if we engage in that conversation about these 3 questions, and then we can do this board, and if you have any questions. So thank you.